This is Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. Welcome to a presidential election year. That statement makes your blood run cold. You are not alone. We know it's hard to have political discussions. They often get heated. And in 2024, it's going to be hard to avoid those conversations. But we are dedicated to showing you that it is possible to get heated without getting disrespectful or giving up on the conversation entirely and walking away in disgust. So today we present a defense of the Trump voter. It's so easy for Democrats and liberals more broadly to assume the other side is all fascists or idiots or they're misled. And whichever of those three is the case for you or someone you know, it's often assumed that Trump voters are irredeemable, that they're not worth talking to. Our guest today wants you to think again.
There are no surprises here. It's not the case that the right is simply stupid or essentially a fascist. Like we know all the negative stuff, and yet we think the left is worse.
Frank Buckley, author and foundation professor at George Mason University, joins us in just a moment. Stay with us.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Big box retailers, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a bill in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. Senate Bill 1838 would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, visit handsoffmyrewards.com and tell them to oppose credit card routing legislation paid for by the Electronic Payments Coalition.
Before we get started, we want to say a special hello to those of you who are listening on Slate Plus. We really appreciate your support. If you want to join the club and support the work we do at Hear Me Out, that's great news. Slate Plus is easy to join, and there are a ton of perks. You get to listen to Hear Me Out and all your favorite Slate shows totally ad-free, and you'll be able to read all of Slate's site without a paywall. Plus, again, you are helping support the show. If you're able, we'd love to have you join us for as little as $5 a month. If you want to know more, head over to slate.com/hearmeoutplus. And thanks. Welcome back to Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. After the 2016 election, there was a flurry of news stories about Trump voters, describing their lives, their thoughts, their concerns. And sure, some Americans were surprised by the number of people who voted for Donald, but the profiles of his voters began to go beyond news and become a form of journalistic othering. Research shows Americans are not just politically polarized. We have a hard time viewing the people we disagree with on lots of things as human. And most of us have no desire to converse with the so-called other side. This show, by the way, hopes to fix that. But if you're heading into the new year, a presidential election year, feeling suspicious, angry, or confused by those who yearn for a second Trump presidency, our guest today encourages you to think differently, to think about Trump supporters not as misled or delusional, but as people who honestly believe he is the better option. So we are joined once again by Frank Buckley. He's a foundation professor at George Mason University's Scalia Law School. And many months ago, he joined us to talk about an American secession. Frank, welcome back. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So for those who didn't hear that prior discussion, tell us what you do.
I am a professor at Scalia Law School of George Mason University. I teach a course on the framers. I'm originally from Canada. I worked on the Trump campaign in 2016. I don't think it's correct to describe me as a Trump supporter right now. I think the whole thing is crazy. But I think, like you, I'm saddened by the divisiveness in the society and the way in which, as you've noted, we don't talk to each other, right? We're sequestered in our separate animosities, and that's simply sick. So we've got an election coming up, and I think for a lot of people, this is really quite simple because the people on the other side are essentially fascists. So when you call them that...
You mean regardless of what side you're on?
Yeah, that kind of takes care of conversation thereafter. Either they're fascist or they're really, really, really stupid. There was a cartoon in the Washington Post the other day by Ann Telnis, which portrayed the Trump voter as a lady whose brains are being scrambled by an egg beater wielded by Donald Trump. So, either these are pathetically stupid people or they're fascists, but in either case, we don't have to pay much attention to them, right? And what has happened, I think, is that people have been looking for one of the most delicious of pleasures that are out there, which is a sense of justified hatred. And they've been offered it by the media, by many outlets in the media, and it's an addiction. It triggers the dopamine reward receptors in your brain, and you keep coming back for a fix, and that's a sickness, roughly. So that's one version of what's going on. The other version of what's going on is, the other side, the Trump people, the Trump supporters get it. They aren't stupid. They aren't fascists. They just think the other side is worse. Okay, and yeah, and it's really that sick. And maybe the people, on the other side, not accustomed to hearing any criticism of themselves, utterly self-righteous, preening in their own virtue, should recognize that there are some complaints that might be laid at their doorstep as well. So for the Trump supporters, recognizing that Trump is kind of mad, bad, and dangerous to know, and all of that, the fellow with all the crazy tweets and some of the crazy ideas and the crazy statements, bad as he is in some respects preferable to what we've got. I mean, if you think that Trump, for example, imagine a Trump presidency where Trump unleashes the Department of Justice on his opponents,
which he said he will do.
And purports to change the norms of our society in all sorts of ways. And what you've got is basically what the left is doing now.
Well, I'm going to stop you here because I want to make sure we have clearly articulated what your opinion is. It sounds like you're saying that Democrats specifically and liberals more broadly unfairly demonize Trump supporters. Is that a good boiling down of your opinion?
Yeah, they do, and they're encouraged to do so. I mean, if you look at the advice columns in the places like the Washington Post, you're told on how it is that you should not talk to your parents or your uncle or your cousins if they disagree with you. I mean, this kind of breaks up families. It produces a great deal of loneliness. We're in the middle of a loneliness epidemic in America. And part of it has to do with the divisiveness of all of these partisan hatreds that are out there. So I think that's rather sick. And I think, look, this is an aristocracy. Let's start with the idea that this is really an aristocracy. I've lived in other countries. They're much more egalitarian. So if you're a member of the elite, you're one of life's winners, right? You're white, Western, and wealthy. Okay. I mean, that describes most of the people on the other side.
It describes a certain slice of people on both sides.
Well, actually, I really want to say that if we are an aristocracy and you want to describe America's elite, what you're talking about are the kind of people I just described, who get the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on. That's the aristocracy, right? And, and one of the problems here is for people on the left, what they're saying is, look, it's not merely the case that this is an aristocracy where your children are going to get ahead and mine won't get ahead so much. This is not true of other countries. It's true of aristocracies like America. So, it's bad enough that you're on top of things. But on top of that, you're kind of smug about how you got there. And you've ignored the fact that our jobs have disappeared. They've gone to other countries. And we're suffering the deaths of despair, right? I mean, longevity rates have declined for white Americans in particular, but men in general. And
life expectancy has gone down.
And we don't pay attention. That's not a story. All right. Climate change is a big story. The deaths of despair is not a story. It doesn't count. It won't be reported.
Okay, so we have found another point of agreement here that You're right. And for listeners, I'll say that life expectancy in the United States has fallen, especially for white men, for years now. And one of the lead authors of the study a couple years ago, when he was asked what was causing that decline, said simply despair. And I agree with you. We're not covering that in an age of an epidemic of loneliness. I do want to quickly say that the Republican Party is more white than the Democrats, although Democrats have lots of white people. More than 8 in 10 Republican voters, as of 2022, were white. They have generally been suburban voters and middle class. And in fact, the number of white voters without college degrees shrunk among conservatives in the past few elections, going back all the way to 2016, although many of them are older. So the demographics, I would argue with you there that our surveys don't quite show that the elite, so-called, are on the Democrat side. I would also say that, going back to the original point, I think it's perfectly possible as a right-wing person to completely surround yourself with only news from conservative sources. You could be watching Fox News, there's the Washington Examiner, there's the Epoch Times, there's Newsmax, there's the Blaze, there's the Daily Wire, there's the Washington Times, there's Daily Caller. You can entirely only get your news from conservative sources, and we know that many of them do. So I think our point of debate here is mostly that this is somehow worse or better on one side or the other. I think both sides are capable easily of isolating themselves and only speaking to the people who agree. And that should be a point of common ground where we can say, look, conservatives call liberals fascists and child traffickers without evidence. Liberals call conservatives brainwashed. And perhaps we need to humanize each other and learn how to talk to one another.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think a good start would be by way of taking a look at what legitimate complaints people may make from the other perspective. So I've mentioned some of them, for example. I've said we're a class society. We've grown an aristocracy. When you compare us to other countries, the likelihood that your children will do well is really the test of aristocracy. And we're kind of up there with countries like England. I mean, the really egalitarian countries are countries like Denmark and Canada, and we're not even close to that. So if you wanted a more egalitarian society, there are a lot of things you could do which would be pleasing to the right and some that would be pleasing to the left. For example, lowering tuition for university would be good for mobility, but there are other issues like immigration, K-12 schools, the regulatory state, where the right has complaints about how we become an aristocracy, and you might listen to them.
So we have to take a break here, but I think moving into what people's concerns are is a really, really fertile ground for discussion here. I'm guessing we're going to find more agreement there, but we'll take this break first. You're listening to Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley, and we will be back in just a moment.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Big box retailers, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a bill in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. Senate Bill 1838 would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, visit handsoffmyrewards.com and tell them to oppose credit card routing legislation paid for by the Electronic Payments Coalition.
Join me, 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty, on my podcast, My Life of Crime, as I take on true crime investigations like no other. This season, I'm looking into the labyrinth of crime and secrets within families. I'm cutting straight to the evidence and talking to the people directly involved, including investigators and the families of victims. Listen to My Life of Crime with Erin Moriarty wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. I'm Celeste Headley, and this is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. Today we're talking to Frank Buckley, who I think it's fair to say is an old school conservative. Is that fair, Frank?
Yeah, I call myself a progressive conservative. I'm kind of an Eisenhower Republican. Back in the day, back in the 60s, that was a totally different Republican Party. And there are elements of that today. I mean, the Trump movement, amongst other things, was rejection of a right-wing Republican Party. And I feel more at home with an older Republican Party represented by people like Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and Eisenhower. And there were echoes of that in Trump.
So I was a Republican as well, as was my whole family. The first president I voted for was George H.W. And I agree with you that the Republican Party of my first election is not the Republican Party we see today. For me, it's mostly the intrusion into personal lives. But I want to go back to this where we started, which was that your belief that people fundamentally misunderstand Trump voters or misunderstand why anybody would vote for Trump again. So can we talk about that? Let me just say that part of the difficulty for me in understanding someone who still supports Trump is, as a journalist, I don't tend to trust any politician, period. I don't care what party they're with. I have seen the sausage being made for a quarter of a century, and it's not pretty. But I have never seen a politician like Donald Trump in any political party. I mean, I've never seen anybody who lies like that. I've never seen anybody with this many indictments that even Bill Barr, Trump's attorney general, agrees many of them are sound charges. And so for me, am I being unfair? Like, we're talking about people who would vote for somebody who lies continually and about everything, and has been quite credibly indicted dozens of times.
Well, I don't know about credibly indicted. One thing that's interesting here is how the more that the criminal charges pile up, the more popular Trump gets, which is essentially the right flipping the bird at the left on all of this. What the right is saying in all of this is basically the state in the hands of the Democratic administration going after a political enemy. I'm not crazy about Trump at this point. I don't know that he'd be a successful president. But if you want me to go through the litany of reasons why I object to Joe Biden, I'm happy to do so. Let's just say
That's kind of a different conversation, right? Our conversation today is focused on whether or not. Yeah.
I don't know. That's the point. It really isn't. I mean, if what you're looking at is, who will take care of me better in the next 4 years, the Biden record is not a particularly attractive one for a lot of voters. Okay, and so it's more complicated than just saying, well, the man's a rogue. Right. And yes, if he's a rogue, try to explain why people support him when it's the case that we know all of that. Right. I mean, there are no surprises here. It's not the case that the right is simply stupid, the way that the Washington Post portrays him, or essentially a fascist, which is how a lot of people in the New York Times regard him. Okay. Like we know all the negative stuff, and yet we think the left is worse.
So, okay, I here's why I think that talking about Joe Biden is a different conversation. We're still in the primaries, which means if you're a Trump supporter, it means you're choosing Trump over all of the other candidates, including Nikki Haley and others who do not bring the baggage and haven't lied to you as many times as Donald Trump has. Who does not have multiple very serious counts against them, both national, federal counts and state counts. And we just found out that his businesses took in millions and millions of dollars from foreign entities, 20 different countries, while he was still president.
Yeah, this is not a big deal. He's about the only president who left office worth considerably less than he had when he walked into office. I mean,
but he also went into office having a lot more.
Everybody else has made tons of money, Obama in particular. But but just about every president has, in fact. Anyway, look, if you want to talk about lies, don't get me started on the Russian collusion hoax. Don't get me started on things like the mostly peaceful George Floyd riots, or how defunding the police is going to be the answer to all of our problems. I mean, people on the right they understand the lies. Somehow they don't take them seriously, right? They realize it's a guy who's posturing, and what they're trying to look at is, as between two people, who's going to treat me better? Who's going to govern better in the next 4 years?
So this is another point of contention, because some of the things that you said, I won't take time to fact check, but
fact check. You want to fact check defund the Russian collusion? I mean, I was there. I wrote the foreign policy speech that Trump delivered.
Yeah, I was there too. As a journalist covering it with no stake in the game. But let's talk about the fact that they think they're going to be treated better under a Trump administration, because I don't see that for the average Trump voter. They really got a whole lot out of the first Trump administration. They definitely lost when it comes to economics, the average Trump voter, definitely. I
disagree. No, they did better. So I totally disagree. And who did really quite well is American blacks.
No. No, not in comparison with, you cannot say that African Americans disproportionately did better. They're still at the bottom of pretty much every scale. But
the wage gap between African Americans and white Americans declined. Now it's expanded.
Oh, actually, we had recently we saw the very first average increase, significant increase in the wages for the lowest earners. Recently, this is just, I think, earlier this year. But again, there's one thing first. There was this myth that most Trump voters were working class, and it turns out they were not. The over 50% were not. But the other thing is that the working class support of Trump, his voters are better off economically when compared with the average American, period. And that makes you have to sort of parse out how they did under his tax cuts, because there's no argument among economists that his tax cuts benefited those at the very highest end of the scale, not the middle class and working class. Even if they were his supporters, working class did make up the majority of his supporters, they didn't benefit from his tax cuts.
Actually, the economy under Trump did fairly well. What people are looking at right now is inflation, which they attribute to an out-of-control spending machine in the White House. So that probably is going to be a big part of the election right now. But something, we're not going to get anywhere just comparing two people, both of whom are flawed. Personally, Trump more than Biden, I'll grant you that. But, Biden himself does not exactly inspire confidence. So if you want to find a middle ground as between both sides, you won't get there by saying roughly, how dare you support Trump?
It's not, I don't think, okay, so certainly on my point, I'd never say, how dare you support that person. I've seen all kinds of confusing behavior in my career as a journalist. It's not that so much as it is, again, as somebody for whom accuracy, fairness, evidence-based policies, I am confused by someone who would still believe a Trump administration would benefit them. This is somebody who said he was going to reduce the national debt, and it's expanded massively because of the tax cuts. And so that makes he had the third biggest deficit increase of any president in U.S. history. So that makes me go back to the Trump voter and say, look, if fiscal conservatism is a big part of your beliefs, then why do you still want to vote for Donald Trump? That's where we get back, because I want to pull it back again to misunderstanding or maybe mischaracterizing the motivation for voting for him.
Yeah. Well, if the voters are asked to compare how they did under Trump and how they did over the last 3 years, I prefer to just listen to them. I mean, I'm not going to tell them, you fools, you think you did well under Trump, but you really didn't, and I better than you do on this one. That's not going to get us anywhere. Why don't we listen to them rather than tell them what they have to think? So, I mentioned inflation as being a big issue. There are a lot of other ones there. There also are cultural differences that are important. I mean, the right is, I think, looking at changes which they're required to accept at this point, which they find troubling. I mean, you started with trigger warnings, cultural appropriation, unconscious racism, transgender rights, drag queen story hours. There's a whole cultural change which they feel uncomfortable with, and that's okay. They're permitted to feel uncomfortable with that, about that, right? I think a lot of people would say, no, that's not okay, and that's where the debate is. I mean, is one permitted, for example, to object to drag queen story hours, right? Well, in fact, if you read, some of the newspapers, the Washington Post and so on, the answer is basically not, right? There's something really wrong with you. So I think you might start by saying there are, as between the two kinds of voters, there are important differences in terms of values. And if you want people to get along with each other, I think one has to begin by recognizing the validity of those feelings. It's not enough to say, well, if you have problems with euthanasia rights for minors, there's something deeply morally wrong with you. I mean, you see, the way it is, if one's on the right now, it's not merely that you're asked to accept beliefs that you don't agree with, but you're also told there's something deeply morally wrong with you if you disagree.
Again, how is that different from the way the right characterizes the left? Because if for those who do believe that because someone is transgender, they still have the right to live their life unharassed, I have seen and heard the way those people are spoken about among the right wing. I have even been called horrible things. Again, not a member of the Democratic Party. I've been called terrible things. I've been accused of supporting child trafficking. I've been accused of supporting rape. I've been accused of supporting the murder of conservatives, and violence, even though, again, we don't have a January 6th moment on the left, the way that we can point to violence on the right. So how is that different? I agree that one should not be demonized for one's beliefs, but the right is doing that too.
Well, actually, I don't think you should try to get much mileage over personal stories about things said to you. I mean, honestly, I don't think so. I think with respect to gays and whatnot, transgenders, what the right, I think most people on the right would feel is, look, they can live their lives, but don't force me to change my beliefs about what's right and wrong in these issues. But, I
guess. But again, we're talking about, I mean, for example, we know now that only 11 people in the entire United States were responsible for over 60% of all requests to ban specific books. We're not even talking about a minority. We're talking about a tiny number of people who are very loudly. We also know research shows us that the vast majority of Trump voters are much more liberal in their beliefs, especially on social issues, than Trump is, or at least as he has spoken to be. So, I mean,
actually, Trump is a New Yorker.
He used to be. We're going to take a break here. He's now a Floridian. But in any case, we'll take another break and we'll come back to try to understand why the society in general is maybe unfairly demonizing Trump voters. So stay with us. This is Hear Me Out, and we'll be back.
We all need advice sometimes.
Right? Someone to say, I get it. I've been there too.
But often it's hard to know where to turn, which is where we come in. Hi, I'm Carvel Wallace.
And I'm Courtney Martin. We're both authors and journalists who love finding solutions to problems.
Every week on Slate's How To podcast, a listener comes on our show to receive advice from a world-class expert.
We've covered everything from parents with radically different politics to people learning to love their insecurities.
We've helped listeners breathe better, sleep better, and even have better sex.
Speaking of sex, we're all getting screwed by a warming planet. So we've also learned how to cope with climate change and how to say goodbye to our pets.
Life is messy and complicated, but we're all in this together, so let's help each other.
Look for How To from Slate wherever you listen to podcasts.
What is wellness?
I think of the image of wellness personally as like pure joy.
It seems like a basic question, one we all want the answer to.
Wellness are the things your grandmother told you to do.
Yet, when you really start to think about it, the answer feels more complicated.
I'm not a sober person. I am on the kind of sober curious spectrum.
I'm Maya Feller, registered dietitian nutritionist and author.
And I'm Dr. Kavita Patel. We're the hosts of Well Now, Slate's new podcast on wellness.
Every week, we'll talk with all sorts of experts in the wellness industry, from doctors and nurses to nutritionists and fitness instructors.
I should have been really happy that I finally have achieved this body of my dreams, but I was actually more miserable than I'd ever been.
To biohackers and zero-proof cocktail makers.
I want it to become so that 20 years from now, every wedding, every business conference, every house party has a high-quality non-alcoholic drink.
And people just like you who will share what they've learned on their way to wellness.
We'll cut through the noise and get to the heart of what wellness means now and what it means to you.
Join us every Wednesday as we tackle that simple yet important question we all want the answer to. What does it mean to be well?
That's Well Now from Slate. Our first episode drops January 10th. Follow us wherever you listen to podcasts.
And we're back. I'm Celeste Headley. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. And we have a few minutes left to talk with Frank Buckley about Trump voters and why we should hear them out. And here, Frank, as you might expect, I'm all for hearing people out. I mean, I think you said before we took a break that we should let Trump voters tell us why they still support him. However, again, as a journalist, I got to say that oftentimes when I do interview someone who still votes for Trump, many of their facts are not correct, which leads me to believe that they have been misled.
Right. That gets back to the Aunt Helena's cartoon of Trump with an egg beater messing up the brains of stupid Trump voters. They really are peons, aren't they? And we're an aristocracy and we can look down at them.
No, I'm just talking about they're wrong about things. Yeah. They get things inaccurate.
For
example,
we have truth on our side and virtue, and they are basically fascists. Look, nothing kills a discussion more quickly than somebody who says, there are my facts and, this is it, and you're just stupid.
No, I'm saying that there are things that are facts and provable. For example, in one of his recent interviews, Donald Trump said that his support among black voters increased by 4 or 5 times. That is provably, measurably incorrect. It's not up for discussion. It's not up for interpretation. That's not spin. That's just wrong.
Mm-hmm. He tells a lot of mistruths. A lot of lies. But if you want to get back to how do you get both sides talking to each other, I think the way to do it is to start talking about policies. So, are there economic or political policies that the right has that are worth listening to? And frankly, inflation is one of them. So that's going to be a big issue in 2024 this year. So,
okay. So in the few minutes that we have left, maybe you can tell us because I know perfectly well that debating people on facts will not get you anywhere, regardless of what your politics are. So since we both agree that both sides need to talk to one another more, need to humanize one another more, maybe you could give us some ideas on how to talk to a Trump supporter.
Interesting question. Well, if you wanted to persuade him that inflation was not simply a Democratic Party issue, you might say, what about spending under Trump? Because that went up as well. as you noted. So nobody's got exactly clean hands here. Moreover, I really think it's the case that a lot of people on the Trump side went crazy on the subject of tariff protections.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I mean, it would be well to recognize again that nobody's perfect in all of this. One of the first things that Trump did was he reauthorized the sugar tariffs, which is a huge scandal, right? We pay about 60%, 70% more than the world price. And the cost is borne disproportionately by low-income people. So there are things like that. You know, if you wanted to persuade Trump voters that Joe Biden has really had a lot of wonderful policies, you'd have a tougher time of it than trying to explain how things were not exactly so great under Trump. So maybe it would, I guess maybe if you started by conceding the good faith of people on the other side, they're not stupid, they're not fascists. Maybe they have a rose-eye view of what Trump was like, and maybe there are some factual issues that could be brought up. But, start by assuming that they're not exactly moral cretins, and they're actually your friends and your relatives and your parents and your grandparents, right? And there's no reason to cut them off completely. Because if you do that, what you've decided is that nothing trumps ideology. And that's really a sickness right now, right? I mean, ideologies are bad per se in terms of your moral vision, because they permit you to think that you're all right, and you aren't. I mean, nobody is. We're all, kind of fallen humanity, and you don't get a pass by having the right kind of political views. You're still, the line between good and evil still runs through your heart. So start with self-doubt.
I could not agree with you more. And to that end, for those on the left who say Donald Trump didn't do anything good, one of the things I really appreciate that Donald Trump did was the transparency in the executive order improving transparency in healthcare. I think that was an excellent decision, and the Trump administration made a priority, and they got it accomplished.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about that. I mean, early on, I told Jared Kushner, the Canadian healthcare system is not as bad as people say. We could do better, right? We could do better in Obamacare. And the next day, Trump said exactly the same thing. He said, it's not so bad, but we can do better. And it didn't happen because he got fobbed off by libertarians in Congress like Paul Ryan. So once again, I say the man started out as a bit of a progressive, right? And he didn't get anywhere with that because of a right-wing Republican Congress. So it's not the Republican Party I'd like to see. It's not the Eisenhower Republicanism that I like. We're still trying to get there, and we won't get there whatever happens in 2024.
So I feel like it's going to be difficult to make an argument that he was progressive when he launched his campaign hoping to build a wall that Mexico would pay for, and calling Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals. So maybe the solution here, Frank, is to leave Trump out of it and try to get to know people as people and say, look, we're not going to agree on this. So maybe we can talk about something else. For example, Frank, I often do play a game where I'll say, like, I bet in 3 questions we can find something we agree on. Now, I mean, we've already done that. There's stuff we agree on. But, it's usually something like, would you agree that dogs are better than people?
Totally.
Yeah, see, agree on that. Would you agree that tacos generally make everybody feel better?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty in life to talk about that's not Donald Trump.
Absolutely right. Look, let me put it another way. There are 2 different kinds of parties which are bigger than the people behind them. There's a country party and a court party. The country party regards itself as being outsiders. The distinction actually goes back to English politics in the 18th century, but it was also big in 1776. There are some people who see themselves as people on the outs, and some people who are the court party, who are very much people in power, right? And those differences are going to, they've been with us forever. I mean, you go back to Andrew Jackson, William Jennings Bryan. Those are big differences in our society, and we've managed to live through them, those differences, and we've worked things out. And I think we have to do exactly the same in the next couple of years, whatever happens, and pay less attention to flawed people leading the charge, more attention to the good nature of people on the other side.
Hear, hear. And that was such a good sentiment, Frank. I'm going to let you have the last word, so I appreciate it. And I appreciate you coming back to talk with me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always fun.
Okay, so we want to know what you think. And we're being honest here. This isn't just something we say. It is something that we want. We want to hear your thoughts. And I know that when someone says Happy New Year and I respond by saying Happy Presidential Election Year, I realize that is ruining it for everyone. I realize people don't appreciate the fact that we're about to head into a morass of hatred and campaign stops and talking points. I know that doesn't make anybody happy, but maybe that's something we can all agree on. In any case, whatever you may think, we want to know what your thoughts are. It's so easy to do. Just email us. It's hearmeout@slate.com. Now, we got a lot of mail from you over the holidays, and we would love to share all of it, but we can't. So for now, we'll share one. Last week, we had Zach Rosen on the show to talk about giving and getting advice in the new year, any new year. We spent a lot of time agreeing in that conversation, but there were moments where we did not agree, and we want to share a letter from a listener we got named Ofra. Ofra wrote this. Here's the quote from you I'll embroider on a pillow. Advice from other people is a solution to a problem you don't have. Having bought into 2 professional coaching courses in the past 2 years, I'm still trying to understand why I was attracted to these prescriptive advice platforms. There are a lot of answers, including the culty nature of such programs, but I think your explanation is key. Followers of coaches and success programs try to be like the guru when that's not who they are. We can't all be mini-me's. A one-size-fits-all formula is not helpful in discovering who we are. Thank you for your non-advice advice. You're welcome, Ofra. I say let's both decide in the new year that our resolution is to not take advice from people who don't know what they're talking about. But in any case, we would love to hear your thoughts, if not your advice. The email address is hearmeout@slate.com. Hear Me Out is a podcast from Slate. The show is produced by Maura Currie. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations, and Alicia Montgomery is VP of Slate Audio. I'm your host, not your guru, Celeste Headlee. Until next time, speak your mind, but keep it open.